Super warm welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have Natalie here with us from Paradigm. I wanted to give a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. So just a heads up, it is a recorded chat. I actually would warmly encourage everyone, if you're comfortable, and I know Zoom fatigue is real, but to turn your cameras on. This is like an awesome chat with Natalie. You want to be, present, personable. And so it would be great to see your faces, and I see many of them, which is awesome. To introduce ourselves, we are South Park Commons. Natalie, we're so excited to have you joining our community as our guest today. We are a group of builders, tinkerers, founders, subject matter experts, deep diving, technology enthusiasts. And I, in particular, am part of our founder fellowship, which is a group of folks going from -1 to 0. So pre-idea, very early stages of company building. South Park community, very excited to have Natalie. She is the co-founder and head of services at Paradigm. Her team helps companies bring diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies to life through high impact trainings and long-term strategic partnerships. She's worked with dozens of amazing companies across industries. Some that you might have heard of are Airbnb, Box, Capital One, GE, IDEO, Intuit, and Stripe. And before co-founding Paradigm, Natalie worked on Google's people analytics team, and she did a lot of incredible, meaningful work there. She's an expert in this field. She's led hundreds of unconscious bias workshops for tens of thousands of people worldwide, and her work has been featured in lots of publications. So Natalie, really warm welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here. And I'm excited to dive in. I will ask Natalie some questions to kick us off for about the first half hour or so. If you have topics that come up as we're going, I would super encourage you to chat your questions. You can chat them to me directly if you want me to ask it. If you post it in chat for everyone, I'll also circle back as we go, and we'll leave a good chunk of time for questions towards the end. The goal is really for this to be interactive, helpful. So definitely feel free to dive into the chat. It's super welcome. So with that, let's kick it off. Natalie, we would love to hear a little bit about, as a founder, what inspired you to create Paradigm?
Yeah, great question. So I thought I would start by just kind of backing up and talking a bit about what got me into this space of organizational psychology, and really kind of what got me passionate about doing this work, where I really focus primarily on the experiences of people at work. So I went to graduate school for organizational psychology, mainly because I cared about a very simple thing. If people are going to show up and spend a lot of time at work, they should be happy. And so studied organizational psychology. And when I was looking at jobs, I decided that I wanted to go to an organization that I thought did this work really well and really prioritized their people as a way to learn. And so I was really lucky to land a job at Google, a company who I really think obviously leads the charge when it comes to creating a great experience for employees, and is really progressive in this space. Not to mention they had a really great people analytics team, people who had backgrounds like mine, where they're using kind of their knowledge in psychology, analytics, and research to understand the employee experience and optimize it. And so it was kind of in that time that I started becoming really passionate about not just creating a great experience for employees, but especially creating a great experience for employees who are traditionally and historically marginalized and underrepresented at work. That work was just aligned both with just a passion I have for equity, but also self-serving in a way, because I identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus population. I was a really kind of involved member in Google's employee resource group for the LGBTQ plus community, the Gayglers, a really great name. And actually, kind of through my work with that employee resource group, decided to focus my career on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So basically, I was doing a lot of great work at Google, learning from a lot of folks who really know how to do this work well. And that was when I met our CEO, Joelle, who actually at the time was a practicing attorney. She decided that instead of suing organizations for being exclusive and being inequitable, she decided there's got to be a better, more proactive way to do this work. And so her idea actually for Paradigm was that we need to help organizations use data and research to create more equitable and inclusive cultures proactively. And so she found me to kind of help kind of build our services and really kind of think about how to do this work well. And I decided, why not? I really wanted to, do DE&I work as a career, and I thought it was a great time to try something new. So I hopped on over to Paradigm, and that's how things got started.
That's amazing. And I'm curious, we have a mix in our community of solo founders, co-founder groups. How did you actually sort of get to know, that working with your co-founder partner was sort of the right fit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one thing I know we mentioned when we were getting to know each other yesterday was that I think finding a really great team of founders is essential, and really finding folks who complement and round out your skill set and expertise is key. And that's really something that I saw in Joelle right away. Joelle is our CEO and co-founder, but she, coming from a background in law, really was amazing when it came to writing, to speaking publicly about our work. She was really kind of the external facing kind of co-founder. I was not, and I never have like that part of the co-founder life. What I was really passionate about was kind of on the back end, figuring out how do we do diversity, equity, and inclusion work well? How can we be truly data-driven? How can we help our clients really have impact? And so I would say, obviously, we both wore many hats in the early days. I kind of primarily focused on figuring out what do we do and how do we add value to our clients? Well, Joelle really kind of led that. How do we talk about our work? How do we kind of get our name out there? How do we kind of engage clients and get them on board with our philosophy and our approach? And then our third co-founder, Dr. Carissa Romero, actually came from academia, and she really rounded out our founding team, bringing on board a really kind of deep expertise in the academic literature around what does it take to create an inclusive environment. So I'm really proud of our founding team and how different we all are. So I knew it was a fit because I saw right away how much we complemented one another.
That makes a lot of sense, that sort of complementariness of skills, of personalities, of people. I'm curious, I think it's back in 2014 when you started Paradigm. Like, what was some of the early sort of ideation and, thinking about what you wanted to work on? Like, how did you decide this was sort of it?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting when you're in the early days because you're definitely kind of building the plane as you're flying it. Although we're 6 years into being an organization, I still feel like we're building the plane as we fly it, which I think is an important thing to call out. But what that means is that, in the early stages, it's actually really interesting. Our CEO did not want to do training, for example. She actually did not want to get in the business of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion focused training, like unconscious bias, for example. She was really passionate about coming in and helping organizations take a step back and have a really comprehensive data-driven strategy around how do you actually move the needle. She thought training was maybe not going to have the right impact. That said, there was a huge kind of need and interest in training at the time. So we started doing it from the beginning. And I think as we started doing it kind of in response to what our clients needed and what the market was kind of telling us was necessary or was a need, we saw the value in it. And we kind of formed our philosophy early on that really great diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts include kind of two main components. One is like efforts to engage and educate individuals. Okay? How do leaders and employees and managers create environments that are not only diverse, but equitable and inclusive? And really a great way to do that is to have really great, well-executed DE&I training. And so we really kind of bought into the value of that. And as of today, this is the biggest part of our business. But we didn't let go of our kind of initial vision that in order to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work well, you need to step back and you need to be strategic. And so we also have an arm that focuses not on the individual engagement and education, but on how do you kind of systematize and kind of integrate DE&I into the way that you operate as an organization? How do you make sure that you're thinking about diversity when you're hiring? How do you promote equity in the way that you make decisions about people, how you evaluate them, who do you promote, but also how you kind of design your culture? So that was really key early on as we kind of thought about our approach to this work and what we do and how that really evolved over time based on what we were seeing in the market.
I mean, it's such an exciting sort of mission and vision. And I know, as we sort of talked about your co-founder, you focused inwardly on a lot of the early sort of strategy and thinking about, how do we develop as a business? And I'm curious, how do you think about balancing, as a sort of a startup, business key performance indicators, metrics around, growth, revenue, business success with that vision and the work that you're doing and the impact you were hoping to have on companies in the world?
It's a really great question. And one thing I would say is, obviously, you always have to think about, are we sustainable as a business, right? Are we making money? Can we afford to bring new people on? But I will say, especially early on, the focus has to be really on doing great work. The focus really has to be on, what are we doing? And are we doing it well? And are we having the impact that we want to be having? And measuring impact can come in many forms. It can come in the form of just gathering client feedback. Are they satisfied with, the services that you're providing? Do they feel motivated and equipped to take action? And that's kind of a signal to us that not only are, for example, trainings really interesting, but are they actually motivating the behavior that we want to see as a way to actually have impact on organizations and their culture, for example. So we did think about impact and quality because that starts to, snowball into your business growing. Because in the early days, you're only going to have a handful of clients. So making sure that they're having a great experience so they can talk about you, so they can refer you to other people. I think that's most important. And that starts to drive kind of your business. That said, it was probably just a few years in, where we brought on our head of strategy and operations, really our first business hire, who started to look at our finances in more detail, who started to look at profitability and margins. And that really is essential. But that really, I think became more tight and more official as we started to kind of understand what we were actually doing, and as we started to understand whether or not we were doing good work.
That makes so much sense. I want to zoom us out a little bit and sort of talk a little bit, since you're an expert on sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you probably know a lot on the trends in the industry overall. And then I want to zoom it back in a little, and we'll talk a bit about things that I think, could be really relevant to folks here, especially founders. Mm-hmm. But I would assume, the ideal would be everyone is sort of thinking about, DE&I from employee number one, from that founder stage. But it's also, challenging and maybe not always the reality. So I'm curious, at what sort of stage do you notice companies starting to think about this as a part of their strategy and culture? And what are your thoughts and takes on that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, as you might imagine, given all the conversation about racial justice and everything happening in our world, not only anti-Black, anti-Asian violence, but also we're all weathering a pandemic that, while it impacts everyone and can impact the experiences of people at work, it disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. Given that reality, it's probably not surprising to hear that organizations of all sizes are really flocking to the DE&I space and starting to think about this stuff a lot earlier than they used to. So I will share, and it's funny because one of my teammates is on the call who's also been around kind of since the beginning. So I'm sure she can attest, but 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was pretty rare that we would have an organization come to us who was less than 200 people. Usually we were seeing folks really get serious about this work when they were more like 500 and had the budget and had the resources to really invest. I remember I was so impressed by one of our clients who was about 200 people, and they decided to hire a head of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was so uncommon. It's not uncommon now. So I do think people are thinking about this earlier on. However, I still don't think people are thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the earliest stage, like right now. But I would say, I think that that should be critical to any founders kind of priorities early on. There's one thing I mentioned to you yesterday, Nadia, is that early on, the team that you build is they're building your organization. So everything that you do with that founding team is going to have lasting impact, whether or not they stay with you long-term or not. So it's really critical, of course, to bring on the right people, but to also prioritize diversity, because there are so many benefits. One just being that you're going to have, the benefit of different perspectives. There's a ton of research that shows that people show up and they collaborate differently when they are working with people who are different than them. Not to mention right now, people, clients, consumers, they care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you go to them with a team of founders who is not diverse, it is likely you might get questions and pushback, whether it's from potential investors or from potential clients and customers and consumers. This is something that actually, our CEO is a white woman. I'm a white woman. I was the first hire. That was not a good start, right? But we knew right away that we had to start to diversify our team and prioritize diversity. Of course, given the work that we do in the DE&I space, but also because we knew it would make us better. So this is something that was really top of mind early on.
I want to double click on something that you said, because I think it's really sort of timely in terms of like Black Lives Matter and sort of a lot of the current events and changes and movements, and how have those impacted, businesses and how they're approaching this. And I would say, anecdotally, it's interesting because I feel like there's a mix both in terms of companies really prioritizing this when maybe they haven't before, but I think you also sometimes have reactions. I think the Coinbase CEO, or I think Basecamp more recently, have sort of said, hey, we're not going to engage. And so I'm curious, like, what are the trends that you've sort of seen here?
Yeah, so I think just one trend is that there is obviously just a much bigger focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion right now, and all organizations, all CEOs are tasked with deciding, how do we want to show up? How do we want to engage? And yeah, Basecamp, Coinbase coming out and saying we are not engaging is a really bold stance, certainly not one that we support or agree with, especially because there's tons of research that shows that employees want their employers to engage. Certainly in issues, political issues, social issues that impact the organization, but also issues that don't. But just issues that are critical if you believe in the importance of human rights and equity. And so I think that's critically important, especially as the workforce becomes more diverse and younger generations care more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was a stat I thought was really powerful that 50% of job seekers actually look for commitment to diversity as they kind of assess potential employers. I always tell the story that I rejected an invitation to join a PhD program because that PhD program did not protect the LGBTQ plus community in their EEO statement and in their student policies.
That's really powerful. And I'm curious, you've worked with so many clients across different industries, but even sort of within the tech industry and high growth startups. And I'm curious, are there sort of unique considerations or attributes around DE&I for these companies?
In the tech space?
Yeah, exactly.
What's really interesting here is that I think in tech, unlike other industries, I just met this morning with a financial services organization. The other day, met with a healthcare company. There are some industries that are catching up, a little bit more behind, tend to be dominated by kind of older, less diverse, super white, to be honest, leaders, especially. And so it means it takes time for folks to catch up with what's going on in the world and figuring out how to talk about this stuff. That's not the case in tech. Just because I think tech skews so much younger, I think that you tend to have a workforce and a set of leaders and CEOs who tend to skew more liberal. but that doesn't mean that issues don't exist. And I actually think sometimes issues are overlooked because people assume, well, I'm liberal, I'm open-minded, but then you have to think, okay, look around, but your team is still primarily white and Asian. And I think sometimes, especially founders and CEOs think, oh, we're diverse because we're hiring people from different schools, or we're hiring people who are not born in the US. That is not the same as hiring people from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in the US. That is not the same as hiring women in tech, groups that have been left out of this industry for so long and continue to be. So I think that the challenge in tech is that, again, we assume we're good, and I think miss opportunities to really do better when it comes to the way that we hire, but also in terms of the way that we create cultures. We don't always ask ourselves the tough question of, are we creating an environment that is truly going to be inclusive for people from all backgrounds, not just people who are in the majority?
Yeah, it really resonates. And I'm curious, you mentioned like sort of I'm curious, like, what does good look like in terms of sort of when things are successful or working, or, this is effectively prioritized, what happens? Because I think many teams struggle to sort of figure out, like, what is the right North Star? Like, how do you craft a strategy around this?
Well, one thing I will say is, and my teammate here, Aya, and I had one of the most difficult, I think, client conversations yesterday that I've had in my career in the DE&I space. And I think it was difficult because we were speaking to a client who thought there must be some like end goal. There must be some silver bullet that will get us from this place of not doing a good job to doing a good job. And I think that the unfortunate reality is that this work is truly never done. So while I'm hesitant to say what good looks like, but I can tell you what progress looks like. I think what progress looks like is consistently and continuing to engage in efforts to promote equity in everything that you do as an organization. I think what that means is making sure that you're monitoring your hiring decisions, your promotion decisions, monitoring the employee experience, monitoring attrition rates, to make sure that you don't see any kind of differential outcomes between demographic groups. So you have like an eye and a lens on equity. And then the lens on inclusion is you're making sure that employees from different groups, whether it be people who identify as women or people of color or people who have a disability, are having the same kind of positive experience at work. And a really good way to monitor that is through surveys, is through having ongoing conversations with employees. And because there are so many things that can make it so that employees who are underrepresented don't have as positive of an experience, you have to consistently and continuously work to create that environment that's going to be inclusive. I think the last thing is continuing to build a diverse organization and build diverse teams. And that is work that's also never done. So I mentioned earlier that in the early stages of Paradigm, we were thinking about building a diverse team early on, and this has always been a priority. It is still a priority today. And every single time we open up a role, whether it's a leadership role, whether we're thinking about a promotion, we always have a lens on, are we building diverse teams? Are we promoting equity? So I think progress is making sure you're continuously measuring these things and having an eye on whether or not you have an organization that is diverse and representative of the diversity of the broader world and broader society. Are we creating an environment that is equitable and we're not seeing demographic differences in outcomes that matter, pay, performance, stuff like that? And also we're seeing people having positive experiences. It's a lot to keep an eye on. Like I said, the work is never done.
No, I love it. And I think sort of measuring progress, I think, makes a lot of sense here. And I'm curious, you mentioned surveys, but how actually do you approach measuring some of these, either, quantitatively, qualitatively? Like, how do you know if things are going in the right direction?
For anyone who's interested in research and analytics, it's really, really fun to measure this stuff. It's why I went into people analytics for my first job. It's also not, I say this carefully, but it's not as hard as people think. Like, there's a lot of data that tends to be available if you're thoughtful about collecting it. So for example, when an employee joins your organization, having folks self-identify on dimensions of identity, like gender identity, race, of course, sexual orientation, disability status, veteran status, age. And then when you collect that data, you could do anything with it, and certainly in a responsible manner, but you can keep an eye on how diverse you are as an organization. You can make sure that what's happening in your organization, decisions are equitable. It's not, I always say, it's not necessarily rocket science, right? You just have to kind of get that foundation in place early. So I think that's critically important in terms of measuring. But then, as we mentioned too, measuring the employee experience is one that could get a little bit tougher, but I think the foundation there is having, surveys that you're running on a regular basis too. This is not stuff that you want to do just ad hoc every now and then. It's stuff that you want to do consistently. And then kind of mapping that quantitative data with qualitative data, which can come in the form of focus groups or just simple conversations, making sure that you're surfacing feedback constantly, I think is really, really key as a data collection method. And I actually think people overlook the value of qualitative data more than anything else, but it's really, really important.
That makes so much sense. And I'm smiling. Zoe and I yesterday were talking about sort of how much signal you can get from qualitative information and data and research. And so I think it's cool to see it applied internally as well as sort of externally to customers. I think that's brilliant. I'm curious, what are some of the common mistakes or misconceptions that you see companies make, especially when they sort of are first starting to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think, one common mistake is that people think in order to prioritize diversity and equity and inclusion, we're going to somehow make the wrong decision, or somehow make decisions that are based on identity but not other things like merit, for example. It's a really common and kind of old school misconception, but nonetheless it still comes up, right? A lot of folks will say, well, does building a diverse team mean that we're going to lower the bar? And what I always try to tell people is it's actually a really problematic belief and I guess thought process to think that in order to bring and build diverse teams, you would have to lower the bar. That is a problematic kind of fundamental belief. But then you have to kind of bring people along and say, it's actually not necessary at all. If you're having a hard time building a diverse team, what you need to do is look inward, look at your processes, look at how you're building your team and see what is the problem here. Are you relying on referrals? If you are, which you probably are at earlier stages, going to your networks, going to your friends' networks. Our social networks tend to be pretty homogeneous. And as a result, you're probably going to find a lot of people who are just like you. So really trying to kind of look at those practices and say, all right, what can we do to kind of break that pattern? Or if, hey, you're just hiring people from Stanford and, Cal, Berkeley, which we see a lot of tech companies do, those, institutions don't do a great job with diversity in many aspects, not just, race, but also socioeconomic status, et cetera. So again, questioning those practices, doing what you can to expand your pipeline is really, really important. And it's just I really think a common misconception that in order to diversify, we have to somehow change our standards or compromise on something, when really what we should be thinking is we are better if we build diverse teams. This is an advantage for us, because it really is. I think another kind of common just misstep, I think, is not being educated. I can't tell you how many leaders have come to me, to Aya, to the rest of our team, asking, what do I do? How do I engage in the conversation about racial justice? What is the role that our organization plays? And while that is the fear and the wondering what I should do is not an uncommon feeling, nor is it a bad one. I mean, I've had that feeling as a founder. I've asked myself, what do I do as not just a founder, but as a leader of an organization? But Googling what to do it's not hard. And there are so many people talking about this stuff that actually I think sometimes leaders and founders get paralyzed when the information is out there. Whether it's just reading more, whether it's following people on social media who are trying to help organizations and leaders do better, whether it's talking to a group of people who are different than you. I think there are so many ways that one can self-educate, but oftentimes we don't. And that's really surprising to me, especially coming from CEOs and founders who are usually so diligent about learning new things, so diligent about kind of pushing themselves and pushing the limits. Why not do that when it comes to kind of building your expertise and comfort with diversity, equity, and inclusion topics?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think sort of as leaders, there's a sense of like, you should care about this. And I think that why is really, really helpful. I want to ask one more question about sort of the industry overall, and then I want to zoom in to sort of early stage, like South Park Commons crew specific questions. But I'm curious, you've seen companies in sort of early stages as well as like high growth and sort of later mature stages. How do, the challenges that companies face as they think about diversity, equity, and inclusion evolve as the company scales and grows and transforms? What does it look like at, 10 people versus 100 people versus 1,000 people? I'm sure it's quite different.
Yeah, it is quite different. I would say that I have thoughts. I'm organizing them in my head. How does this stuff change? One thing I would say is that when you're smaller, when you're 10 people, even when you're sub 100 people, it's a lot easier to make progress on a lot of things. For example, think representation when you're and diversity of your actual team and company. When your denominator is small, 1 to 2 hires makes a huge difference. When I was at Google, we started looking at representation in engineering, for example, when the denominator was 20,000 people. And what that means is even if every single person we hired over a 5-year period came from an underrepresented racial and ethnic group, we still would barely move the needle in terms of representation. That is what happens when you don't prioritize this stuff early. So I would say like really building a diverse team is a little bit easier early on, kind of pre-scale and huge denominator. I think too, that said, one thing that's maybe a little bit harder when you're smaller is to understand data in aggregate. And I think because of that, actually relying more on qualitative data is really key, because it's going to be really hard to figure out, do we have patterns in attrition rates or, different attrition rates for different demographic groups when maybe one group is 3 people. If you lose 1 person or 2, your attrition rate is off the charts. And so really figuring out how to make sense of data is tricky when you're smaller. And like I said, that's where the conversations and the qualitative feedback is really key. And the only other thing I would say is that as you grow, it's more critical that you have put really foundational, structured, well-designed people processes that are designed to promote equity. Because here's what I'll say, hiring practices. You might be able to wing an interview when you're interviewing, 1 to 2 people a quarter or maybe a month, or you're trying to make 1 to 2 hires. But when you're trying to make 1 to 200 hires, having a structured process that will ensure consistency as not only you conduct interviews, but as your whole team does, that's really essential to have those processes in place in order to promote objective decision making, but also to ensure that you're making the best decisions possible about people, whether it's in the context of hiring or the evaluation of performance, promotions, pay, et cetera.
Makes a ton of sense, Natalie. And I know my connection might be a little spotty, but hopefully we're good. I want to ask, and I think you touched on this, but as solo or very early stage founder teams, like sort of tactically, like what advice do you have for how to approach this? And I think, something you touched on that really rings true is, a lot of the signaling that you might sort of rely on or networking, if you don't have a diverse network to begin with, like that can be really challenging. If you're coming from a Stanford and you're reaching out to your classmates, like you sort of already have a bit of a skew there. So how do you think about that? Or what advice do you have?
One piece of advice I have is start to diversify your network now. And I am making the assumption that, for a handful of folks here, you might be kind of earlier stage. But even if that's, or earlier in your career, but even if that's not the case, and that's certainly not the case for me, this is still something I work on every single day, diversifying my network. And the best way to do that is not just to rely on kind of your school, your network based on your institution, right, school, your social network, but also, getting involved in new organizations, professional organizations, even social organizations. Those are all really great ways to start to expand that network right away. And then once you start to expand your network also has their own networks. And so like the effort is pretty exponential once you start to really focus on this. So I do think that expanding your network. I also think really committing to ongoing education about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think is so critical, because the thing is, like, this is not going away. The conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the expectation that organizations, founders, CEOs not only care about this work, but are really well versed in prioritizing DE&I think is going to go from a nice to have to an essential in a very small amount of time. So I would say start educating yourself now. And I think it'll pay off a lot long term.
And I guess one follow-up question there, I think as a founder, like a lot of times when you sort of think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, like hiring and recruiting comes to mind as sort of a key focus area. And I think earlier you touched on, performance, other things that are important. And so I'm curious, are there other parts, especially in sort of the early stages of a company, to think about when you're trying to create sort of a comprehensive strategy or approach here?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would just say is that culture is everything, and making sure that the culture that you're building is one that is going to resonate and feel really inclusive to people from a variety of backgrounds is really, really key. And I will say, I mean, early on, or I could say this can evolve over time. So like early on in the early days of Paradigm, there were 3-4 of us on the same team. None of us at the time had kids. And so we would randomly hold team meetings at 9 p.m. We primarily socialized by, grabbing drinks. And it was a different time, and what was inclusive to that group of 4 people was no longer inclusive as we became 10 people, 20 people, almost 50 people. And so I do think, prioritizing culture, letting it evolve, but also taking a step back. One way to, I think, solidify your culture and ensure that your culture has consistency as you scale. I think one thing that's really key early on is committing to some values as an organization. Whether you say we value, and prioritize having a growth mindset, which is something that's really, really powerful and important to us at Paradigm, and it is infused in everything that we do. Or maybe it's something else, like we value innovation. But if you put those stakes in the ground, that makes the future decisions that you make about your company a lot easier, because you have that cultural value to reference and to kind of hold true to.
I love that. I want to open it up. Everyone's been very, very patient. I'm seeing a lot of great questions come through in the chat. So I'm going to start introducing folks from the community to ask questions. And if you have questions, folks, like feel free to chat them and I'll introduce you. I'd say I'll call on you, but if you can say one fun fact that maybe we don't already know about you, and then ask your question for Natalie, that would be a great way to introduce yourself. Tamina, you have a couple of really great ones. Would you be ready to ask?
Sure. I don't know a fun fact that I can share. I mean, what came to mind is I had a failed attempt during COVID to teach my daughter capoeira on Zoom, which just didn't work, but we're going to try again later. She's got an awesome little outfit for her. I had 2 questions. One was, how do you avoid making talented people that you already have in the company uncomfortable or demoralized by efforts that they see as sort of undermining them and their dominance? And people grow in their understanding of diversity and its value differently over time. So how do you do this without turning away your existing base?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think one thing that's really key is kind of just acknowledging outright that everyone's going to come to this conversation with differing levels of exposure, education, and that's okay. I mean, we even say that at Paradigm, where we're all doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. But we always acknowledge, especially when we talk about things like anti-racism, allyship, unconscious bias, we're all coming to this from different places. But also it's really important to clarify and reinforce that everyone is always learning, right? So even someone who has a PhD in belonging or growth mindset, they still have learning to do as well. And so I think setting that expectation up front and normalizing that is key. I think creating a learning environment and stating up front that like we're all here to learn, and what that means is we might have learning moments. I think that's also key too. I think especially if you're in a position of leadership, being vulnerable yourself. One thing I try to do, especially when I do training to kind of reduce defensiveness, is I talk about the mistakes that I've made in my career, and then people are like, oh, whew. So if a leader in DE&I makes mistakes herself, maybe I can make mistakes as well. But I think that while I say all of this, we also have to, I think, motivate people to be self-sufficient as well, especially if you're talking about people who hold a lot of privilege. I think it still is really important that people hear that a lot of this is on you as well, meaning that like if you do feel uncomfortable or new to the conversation, go educate yourself. And here are some books that I recommend, or maybe here's like a documentary I recommend checking out. But I do think that that's critical. It's not all on the employer. It is certainly not on the marginalized communities to educate you. All of us need to be educating ourselves, especially those who are most uncomfortable. Hopefully that's helpful.
That's very helpful. And then if I could, a follow-up question. SPC is a volunteer-led community.
Yeah.
So we don't have an HR department, we don't hire. And so just curious, I don't know if you've thought about how you would adapt some of these activities where it's completely opt-in and it has to be done by the community. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think like, even if it's opt-in, like at the end of the day, like thinking about how do we make these events inclusive? How do we make sure that the way that we communicate is inclusive? I think that's still just as important. I think one thing that can get confusing sometimes with volunteer-led organizations is who's ultimately responsible and accountable. And I think that could be confusing. But I think where I might start, and where I think a lot of volunteer-led organizations start, is they'll put in place some norms that are meant to kind of contribute to an inclusive environment. So maybe it's, we have a set of meeting norms that we all kind of commit to and that we review every time we meet, or when we organize events, we have a checklist that each organizer follows to ensure that the event is inclusive, meaning, we hold it at different times, for example, or we kind of share the agenda and things in advance for people who process information differently. We record the session for people who maybe can't attend due to like other responsibilities. Like, I think some of those norms that you can set, especially ones that you can kind of articulate in writing, means that like no matter who's responsible or no matter who's leading the meeting or the event, you can at least all follow those. And then I think just asking yourself about, are we kind of positioning ourselves as an organization that is inclusive? And people pick up on whether or not you're inclusive based on a couple different things. One, who's already in the group? Do I see anyone who looks like me? But also the language that you use and the way that you talk about what you do. The more that you can kind of explicitly state your commitment to being an inclusive and diverse and organization, the more likely you're going to attract people from underrepresented and marginalized groups. Great question.
That's so helpful. Noah, I noticed you had a really great question in the chat as well. Do you want to introduce your fun fact and question?
Yeah, fun fact, I'm currently quarantining in the countryside of Ontario, hours north of Toronto. It's colder than I expected.
Wow.
So yeah, I actually have a second question if there's time as well. My first one is, I'd love to hear if there's any companies or individuals who are doing everything that you're describing really well, kind of as an example for the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, it is helpful to, I think, follow and have some of those, lights. I mean, Aya, who's on the call, I would love your thoughts as well. I don't mean to be, this is kind of a cheating answer because it's the husband of our CEO, but I do think Aaron Levy from Box has done a good job being pretty outspoken about equity, inclusion, the role that tech companies in particular play in the broader conversation around racial justice. I think that is a good person to follow. Curious, I also think Slack has done a pretty good job as an organization talking about their commitment to DE&I and doing this work pretty well. But curious if you would add anyone, Aya, just because I have you here.
Yeah, is anyone doing this really well? I would probably say no, just based on the systems that we live in. And also, I think different companies do different aspects well. And I know specific leaders, like individual leaders that I know that are like really driving forward the work internally. For example, like Dr. Aaron Thomas at Upwork, really doing, I think, great things and sharing kind of resources publicly, which I think is really great and something for you all to think about down the line. I think, yes, Slack, especially like their reports have been really helpful. So some are really good about external communication, setting goals, etc. I'm trying to think, I can't name names, but there are some organizations that are really thoughtful about building the equitable people processes and having that in place. I think across the board, manager enablement is probably broken in every company in terms of actually implementing, making sure there's consistent people managing, that people are equipped to support their employees in their advancement and in their growth. So that's definitely something we see across the board, but that wasn't exactly your question, but that is all I have.
Oh, it's a good thing. And I think what I would add too is that, like, again, like taking the kind of learning mindset and growth mindset, like everyone has room to grow and everyone is learning in this space. I think if anyone was doing it perfectly, we would all carbon copy that behavior. We would carbon copy what that specific organization is doing, not just in terms of how leaders are showing up, but how they're actually kind of prioritizing their DE&I efforts. But there's no silver bullet like that. So I would underline that point. To ISP point, there are folks who are doing pieces really well, but again, we got to keep moving forward, getting better.
Cool, thank you for that.
Yeah.
My follow-up might be, and this, I'm not sure exactly how to ask this, but there could be, like, ideally you can have a company and maybe it doesn't wade into some of the thornier issues too much, or maybe you have a really strong perspective from the beginning. And Google seems like an example of a place that might not have had a super strong opinion and got people from across the spectrum. And I haven't worked there, but I understand there's a lot of intense discussion, to say the least, internally. How do you think we should position our companies in terms of, like, here's what we stand for, we want people who are with the program, versus like be a little bit more agnostic, and once people are in the family, then try to work it out amongst each other? Because this could be what precipitated the policies at Coinbase and Basecamp. There was just too much sort of fighting.
Well, I'll just say it's really hard. And I think, like, at the end of the day, leaders and organizations are making a choice. I will say that the easy choice, though, and one that I think is so difficult to argue with, which is why I have a hard time, why I can't agree with Basecamp or Coinbase, is because we're not talking about politics. We're talking about basic human rights. When we say things like Black Lives Matter, when we acknowledge and just speak up against anti-Asian violence, like, this is not a political issue. This is a human rights issue. And I think, like, that is where I just can't imagine, as a leader of an organization, as a CEO, I can't imagine not speaking up and being okay with conversation that, or being okay saying that we are only creating an environment, we are only creating a culture where people who agree with that can work here, right? So, like, I think, what am I trying to say? Like, there's this statement or quote that I'm totally going to butcher, but, like, you can be inclusive of people and their
I think we lost Natalie.
And Natalie, I think you might be frozen. We'll give it a sec and hopefully it bounces back. I always wonder, I'm like, is it my internet? And I think maybe in this case.
What a cliffhanger.
Seeing other folks. I know, I'm very excited to hear this point.
Oh, she's coming back in. She just logged off and now she's coming back.
Perfect.
So sorry about that.
No
Promise
worries.
I was about to say something interesting.
Yeah.
We're excited. We're excited to hear it.
No, I was just going to say, you can be inclusive of people and their beliefs so long as their beliefs are not inherently exclusive. And I think that is the simple statement and one that, I've seen leaders communicate pretty clearly, right? So like, it is okay for employees to disagree. It is important for issues to feel thorny, but so long as like we can all agree that basic human rights are something that we should all care about and fight for. And as long as we can all agree that what we do in the workplace has an impact on broader society, we don't have to fight about that, right? And it's so difficult to disagree with that. That is the perspective I have, and you may argue that it's an oversimplification. That's not to say that these conversations still can't get thorny, but I think that is a rallying cry or something that most people can get on board with.
It's a great answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah.
I have one more question, but I want to make space for others because I already asked one. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to jump in then. I'm curious, aside from hiring and tracking employee experience, how do you help founders and leaders think about diversity and inclusion in their marketing, in the product that they design, in customer success? And I'm wondering in particular, do you measure attrition or complaints or just who's represented in the customer group? And I feel like I've seen it with Google AI. The ethics team there was trying to make some steps forward in this, understanding when products are exclusive. That team got shut down. So curious about thoughts.
Well, everyone should be doing this, and I think there's a lot of room to grow. But just kind of putting an external lens on your DE&I efforts is very important. And I think oftentimes is an afterthought, or oftentimes can come after you've thought about this work internally. But that said, I think it really starts with the data. So if you're in a business where you have clients, where you have customers, where you have patients, just kind of doing your due diligence to collect as much data as you can from those parties, because then that will enable you to ask really important questions later on. Like, are people kind of equally happy, with our services? Do we have people from different demographic groups purchasing our product or our widgets or whatever it is that you're doing or developing or offering as a service? And I think, a lot of our retail clients, for example, that care about this a lot. But if you look at, commercials, if you look at marketing, efforts and ads, you'll see a lot of organizations, a lot of different industries putting a DE&I lens on their marketing. And I do think that that's key because, as we mentioned earlier, not only do prospective employees care about your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, so do purchasers, consumers. As a consumer myself, I am way more likely to engage with a company or even attend or go to a restaurant that I know is inclusive and that it prioritizes diversity. I have never ate at a Chick-fil-A because of their stance on LGBTQ rights. So that's a silly example, but it's true. And I think that is how consumers are thinking these days. And again, I don't think that's going away.
Natalie, to build on that question, I'm curious, and this is sort of in a past life as a marketer, like how do you think about sort of the right balance or approach in terms of wanting to sort of have this information to be educated, but also like not necessarily controlling once you do have it, how is everyone sort of going to handle it? I think my like marketer nightmare was like, by collecting this information, I'm unwittingly enabling someone in the future to do something that's like not so great with this info or exploitative, because now, we have it and they can target off it. And I was really sort of worried about that. And I'm curious, like, how do you find that right balance of sort of being inclusive and thoughtful and educated, but also not taking it maybe too far?
What would be an example of a time where kind of collecting data like that could be misused? I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, I think like this is sort of a like silly example maybe, but I think my fear was like in collecting this sort of demographic data, like, you know, in the future, some ambitious growth marketer is going to like run a, you know, accidentally exploitative campaign because they're like, oh, you know, this is like a prime target for XYZ product.
Totally. That's a really good point. And I think like the point you're getting at that's really critical is that, like, if you're going to start collecting demographic data, whether it be from your employees, from your customers, or whoever, treating that data with the utmost, you know, privacy and confidentiality is so important, especially early on. And I actually think early on is where we can get a little loose with that data. Maybe you're collecting data in a spreadsheet somewhere, right? And I think that you want to get ahead of that pretty early. So anytime you're collecting data on employees and customers, making sure that you're speaking to a lawyer, making sure that you're really tight on your data collection. It's like not a sexy topic, but just a really important one, because data is so foundational to effective efforts moving forward. You want to make sure that it doesn't backfire or cause you issues in the future. And there's a lot of things to consider too, especially if you're collecting data like outside the US, for example. It can be tricky.
Yeah, that's super helpful. South Park Common folks, I think we have space for maybe one or two more questions. I know we're coming on the end here. Does anyone have anything top of mind that they really want to ask? And if not, I have questions, but I want to give room as well.
Not to put Tony on the spot, but he's just making some really good points. I know none of them are questions.
No, I actually do have a quick tactical question that might take only a few seconds to answer. So yeah, do you have any like templates for just like basic demographic surveys? I think like, I know there's like, I feel like the IDEO like data is like super outdated. And yeah, do you have any references for like, yeah, just like a good basic demographic survey?
Yeah, so two, I think, so we partnered with both Culture Amp and SurveyMonkey on their inclusion survey modules. I think SurveyMonkey, their module with demographic questions, I think is still visible to the public. And if not, do let me know, because I'll happy to do some digging. But I think like with those demographic questions, you know, they've worked really hard and we've worked really hard over the years to make sure that we're consistently updating those to be relevant. And I think especially when it comes to certain topics like, you know, language people use around disability, language people use around sexual orientation, those things are changing so constantly that you want to be updating them. But those are two resources I would recommend.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks, Tony. Natalie, I'm going to sneak in one final question, and then I know we're at time, but one thing I like to end on is there anything that's sort of top of mind for you that you want to leave sort of the South Park Commons community thinking about, or, you know, maybe it's something that we could support you with, or sort of what are, and it could be, you know, silly, it could be big, anything, what sort of top of mind for you that you want us to sort of think about, or we could support you in?
That's really nice. And I really appreciate that. I would say, I mean, my ask, only because, you know, our work, like our goal at Paradigm is to help organizations, like through the work that they do, contribute to equity and inclusion, not just within the bounds of your companies and your communities, but in a way that impacts the broader world and broader society. So I would say just like my ask is to keep learning, keep attending events like this, keep you know, engaging in conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you will bring that to the companies that you either start and lead or the companies that you join. And I think the more that each individual is on board and educated with this work, the more impact we will all have. At the end of the day, everyone is better off when we're living in a world that is talking about and caring about this stuff. So that is truly my ask. It seems kind of silly. My other ask is don't hesitate to reach out anytime if you have questions or ever want to talk about this stuff more. I like to make myself available for these conversations.
Thank you so much. That's an exciting ask, and I think one that's like really resonating with me, and hopefully this group as well. With that, I know we're over time. Massive thank you, Natalie. This was amazing. I personally learned a ton and I'm really excited. And big thank you to the South Park Commons community and everyone showed up. Christina, Nicole, Ashley for help organizing and prepping for this. But I hope everyone has an incredible rest of your day. Natalie, thank you again. This was awesome.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. Nadia, great job. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.